Locke and the Founders on Natural Rights, Lecture 3. In the previous two lectures, we talked about some of the basic concepts of Locke's political philosophy, ones that fed, or one of the things that contributed to the political philosophy implicit within the Declaration of Independence. So we have talked about Locke's conception of the state of nature and the law of nature, natural liberty, and natural equality. But now we get to the topic of property and the natural right to property. Now, although I haven't really talked about it that much, obviously, the big three rights that are referred to in the Declaration of Independence are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I haven't talked much about the right to life, although it is implicit within Locke's political philosophy. Now, the right to life is understood to mean the right to preserve yourself and the right to do what you need in order to preserve yourself, which includes the right to defend yourself. So that's the right to life. And the right to life pretty much follows immediately from the law of nature. Because remember, under the law of nature, everybody has a duty to preserve themselves, right? Locke says suicide is wrong. Under the law of nature, you have a duty to preserve yourself because you don't belong to yourself, you belong to God. So you have a duty to preserve yourself, and if you have a duty to preserve yourself, obviously you have a right to preserve yourself. You have a right to do those things you need to do in order to live. And that's the right to life. Every human being has that. Even people who don't have a right to liberty still have a right to life. So children, for example, until they are mature, they reach the age of maturity, do not actually have the right to be their own masters. They are subject, according to Locke, to the authority of their parents. But even though they do not have a right to be free at that point, they still have a right to life, right? They're not things owned by their parents. For Locke, parental authority is a caretaking form of authority. And parents have authority over their children because their children need their parents in order to live and in order to grow and receive an education. And it's limited in character. So children are not the property of their parents. Children retain a right to life and will attain a right to liberty when they reach maturity. But the mentally impaired, the mentally insane, they do not have a right to liberty, but Locke makes it very clear, nonetheless, that they have a right to life, right? They can't just be killed off or something like that because they too are creatures of God. So you have your right to life and you have your right to liberty. Now, in sort of traditional English law, and also if you look at a number of the preambles and bills of rights in the state constitutions, because remember when the colonies declared independence in 1776, each of those states became, in effect, an independent political community. And so very quickly, a number of these former colonies adopted constitutions for themselves and setting up a state government with bills of rights and things like that. And in many of those state bills of rights, you see an invocation of the rights to life, liberty, and property. And that's the one that this kind of sort of trinity of terms, life, liberty, and property, you find those in English law, prior to Locke, and you find them in the state constitutions. And that's what we get to today, this kind of third natural right, the right to property and where it comes from. And this is one of the areas where Locke is rather unique because in the history of political philosophy, it really wasn't the case that most political philosophers believed that there was something like a natural right to property. Now, first of all, let me explain to you what I mean by property, because property has taken, historically speaking, many different forms over the history of the human race. And so the kind of property that Locke is talking about here is really more individual private property. Now, that sometimes property can be defined as something like exclusive dominion. When you're talking about property, you're talking about owning something. And to own something means this thing is mine, and I decide what's done with it. That's what exclusive dominion means. So I decide if I want to store it away, I can store it away. If I want to use it, I can use it. If I want to sell it, I can sell it. If I want to give it away, I can give it away. Whatever it might be, you are the one that decides what's done with that external thing. So even though that external thing is not actually a part of you, it is, for purposes of law, treated as a part of you. It doesn't belong to anyone else. And so that's sort of private property. In the brief reading that I gave you from Nathaniel Chipman, there's a place where he talks about the right to acquire, to use, and to dispose of property. And that's a kind of a more expansive understanding of the right to property. To say that a person has a right to private property means that they have a right to acquire things, which they then have exclusive dominion over. They have a right to determine the use of those things as long as they're not using them to harm others. And they have the right to dispose of those things, where dispose doesn't mean throw away. It means just determine what happens to them. Do you want to keep it? Do you want to sell it? Do you want to give it away? So the right to private property means the right to acquire external things, have exclusive dominion over those things, determine how those things are used, and to determine how those things are disposed of. That is what the right to individual private property is. Now, obviously, there have been lots and lots of communities throughout human history where there has been individual private property. I mean, originally property was kind of a little bit more collectively held within family lineages. But individual private property has existed in many different cultures over the history of the human species. And political philosophers have endorsed the existence of private property. Not all of them, but most of them. But nonetheless, they did not argue that there is a natural right to private property. They tended to see property as conventional. And by conventional, what I mean is that who owns what is determined by laws made by the authority in the community. So you don't have a natural right to any particular thing. Sort of what you can acquire and what you can have is more or less determined by law regarding how things can be made, how they can be exchanged or sold, and all those kinds of things. So the general view was that individual private property is kind of a human invention, and that by nature, nothing belongs to anyone in particular. It's by human law that individual ownership comes about. And this, obviously, you have some political philosophers such as Plato and the Republic criticize the institution of private property and argue for a form of collective ownership, or at least seem to. But really, a lot of other philosophers such as Aristotle, Aquinas, and others, it argued that individual private property is a good thing, that even though by nature everything is kind of common, it makes sense to divide up that commons into individual private property holdings on the grounds that for the most part things are actually better used and better cared for when they are individually owned as opposed to when they are collectively owned. So it was an argument from kind of convenience that a community's resources will be better cultivated and better used when people are allowed to have private property than if everything was kept in common. That was the old view. So that was a defense of private property, but not as an individual natural right. The public authorities, in light of the common good, had the right to determine who owned what. And individuals had no prior right to own anything in particular. So what's distinct about Locke is that Locke actually argues, no, there is a natural right to private property that is not dependent upon the public authority. And in fact, the right to property is an unalienable right. It's an inherent human right that cannot rightfully be denied. And so any legitimate political order is going to respect the right to private property. And this argument had some real influence on the American founding. So it raises the question of, how did this come about? And why does Locke argue this way? And so for this, the main argument for private property comes in chapter 5 of the second treatise. And his argument for private property actually takes two different forms. Or has two different aspects to it. Part of the argument has to do with this notion of having a natural right to those things that you've mixed your labor with. And that's a lot of times what people remember from Locke. Although, as it turns out, that argument doesn't have much applicability in modern society or in his own society. But there's also a second part of chapter 5, which is not so much arguing about a natural right to private property, but trying to show that political societies that allow people to have private property and allow people more or less to buy and sell and exchange on what we would call a free market are going to be more prosperous and more powerful societies. So really part of chapter 5 is a kind of philosophical defense of what we nowadays call a free market economic system. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those because they did have influence on the American founding. But to begin with, Locke acknowledges at the beginning of chapter 5 that initially the earth is given in common to all human beings and nothing belongs individually to anyone. As he says at the very beginning of chapter 5, whether we consider natural reason, which tells us that men, being once born, have a right to their preservation, and consequently to meat and drink and such other things as nature affords for their subsistence, or if we consult revelation, which gives us an account of those grants God made of the world to Adam and to Noah and his sons, it is very clear that God, as King David says, has given the earth to the children of men, given it to mankind in common. But this being supposed, it seems to some a very great difficulty how anyone should ever come to have property in anything. Right, so in other words, the earth is initially given in common. The earth is not subdivided. When you look out, like in primeval forests, there are going to be birds, there might be deer, there are going to be fish in the river, fruit on the trees. But those things aren't individually owned, right? Like you don't pick an apple off a tree and it's not going to say, I belong to Bob. Right? It's just an apple. It can belong to anybody. It's there to be used. His whole point is the earth has lots of resources that we need in order to survive, in order to live well. And so he kind of adopts the standard view that nature is given to man to make use of for his own good, but no particular thing is by nature given to any particular person. And that's what he means by a commons, that the entire human race sort of has a right to use the entire earth. And then he says, but this raises a very peculiar question, because if initially everything belongs in common to everyone, then how can private property ever come about? How can you actually say, this apple here is mine, even though it's given in common to the whole human race? It's mine now, and I'm going to eat it. This fish is mine now, and I'm going to eat it. Right? This cave is mine now, and I'm going to live in it, or whatever. So because the earth is initially given in common to the entire human race, how is it possible for private property to come about at all? And here's what he goes on to say. God, who has given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. And through all the fruits that naturally it produces and beasts it feeds belong to mankind in common, as they are produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, and nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state. Yet, being given for the use of men, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or another before they can be of any use, or at all beneficial to any particular man. So in other words, there has to be some way to acquire things rightfully for yourself. Otherwise, this earth that's given to us can't really be used. You just stand there like, oh, I'm really hungry, I could eat that apple, but it belongs to everybody. It doesn't just belong to me, so I can't eat it. Right? There's got to, in order to make use of the fruits of the earth, you have to have a way of appropriating it, of rightfully saying, this is mine now. So how do you do it? You go on to section 27. He says, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. As he says at the beginning of the next thing, thus this law of reason makes the deer that Indian's who hath killed it, right? That fish you catch is yours. So the basic idea here is this: even though the earth and the fruits of the earth are not initially owned by anybody, you do in a sense own yourself. You are naturally free, right? And to be naturally free, to be your own master under the law of nature, means you're the one that gets to decide what you do with your time, with your talents, with your energy. The work you choose to perform is properly yours because you're not a slave, right? According to Locke, people cannot consent to be slaves. Nobody by nature is a slave to anybody else. Everybody by nature is a free person. And because you're free, you decide what you do with your labor. And then the argument from there is, and therefore, when you mix your labor, when you exert yourself to make or to acquire something, by virtue of that exertion, you remove the thing from the commons and make it your own. By virtue of reaching out to pick that apple, you have made that apple yours, right? And if somebody else wants an apple, you can say, well, go pick your own, right? There are more there. There are ones for other, but this apple's mine. I did the work to pick it, so now it's mine. I did the work to catch this fish. Now this fish is mine. If you want a fish, go catch one yourself. This one's mine because I put in the work to acquire it. And that's Locke's basic argument for the idea that you have a right to private property. You have a right to the fruits of your labor. So you have a right to own those things that you have labored to acquire or to make. But there are certain limitations on this right, and this right really isn't applicable anymore in the same way. So the first limitation is that what you mix your labor with has to be something that's not already owned, right? Because a person could say, hey, being a burglar is really hard work. It's not easy to break into people's houses and steal their stuff. That's labor, right? But when I break into your house and take your stereo, I've mixed my labor with your stereo, so now it's mine. Right? Locke would say, no, that it doesn't work that way because somebody already owned the stereo. This idea of mixing your labor with something to make it yours, that only applies to things that aren't owned yet, right? Like all the fish in the river, or all the apples on a tree out in the wild. Those are things that aren't already owned. So it's only when you're removing something from a commons, only when you're making or acquiring something that isn't already owned, that this idea of mixing your labor with it makes it yours. But like picking somebody's pocket, that's labor. But when you mix your labor with somebody's wallet, when you pick their pocket, that doesn't make it yours. It makes you a thief. So one limit to this idea that you have a right to the fruits of your labor is that you have to be mixing your labor with something that's not already owned. And as he also says, there are two other limiting conditions. As he said at the end of section 29, this right really only holds when there is, as he says, enough and as good left in common for others. So in circumstances where there are lots of fish, you can rightfully say, hey, I caught this fish. If you want a fish, go catch your own. But if you're in a situation where, say, everybody's starving because there's no food and there's only one fish, Locke would say, under those circumstances, if you catch that fish, there's not enough and as good for everybody left. There's just this one fish. And so in situations of dire scarcity like that, the individual right to private property goes by the wayside. And the prior right, the right to preserve yourself, kicks in. So you have a right to try to be the one to have that fish, to take it from the person who has it. Right? If your very survival is at stake, the right to life has priority over the right to property. So the limitations are you have to be mixing your labor with something that's not already owned. There has to be as much and as good, or enough and as good for others left over when you acquire for yourself. And then the third limit is this thing about spoilage, that Locke argues that since the earth is given to human beings to use, you don't have the right to acquire things and then let them go bad. Like pick all of the apples from a tree and say, hey, I picked all these apples, they're mine. Right? You can't have them. And then you sit there and half of them rot before you have time to eat them. Locke would say, no, that's actually immoral. Those apples are there to be eaten. And so if you acquire so many apples that you can't eat them all and some of them go bad, they spoil, that's wrong. So that's kind of a limit to the natural right to property, that you can only acquire as much as you can use without spoiling. So the basic idea here is because you are naturally free, you are the owner of your own labor. Therefore, You also thereby become the owner of anything you mix your labor with, so long as that thing is not already owned, so long as there is enough and is good for others to acquire for themselves to survive, and so long as what you acquire does not spoil. So that's his kind of natural right to property, but it's totally inapplicable to our situation, because we don't live in a time when there's a big natural commons that you can go around taking things for yourself in. Everything's already owned, right? So the fact that everything is already owned means that things have to work a little bit differently, and that's one of the reasons why Locke pivots from this discussion of the natural right to property to talking about the benefits of what we would call a free market society, a society that respects people's right to private property, allows them to work, allows them to acquire, to buy, sell, and exchange more or less freely without governmental interference. And that's what he moves on to. And the way he gets there is through money, because money kind of messes things up. And when he's talking about money, he's talking about gold and silver, these shiny rocks. And the funny thing about these shiny rocks, gold and silver, they're not really intrinsically valuable, but they don't spoil, right? So if you pick a bunch of apples off a tree, way more than you can eat, and then you turn around and you sell them to somebody else, Locke would say, that's fine. You pick a bunch of apples and you exchange them to somebody, and in return, they give you these shiny rocks. So now they've got the apples, it's on them to eat them and make sure they don't spoil. And you've got a bunch of shiny rocks that won't go bad. And so what this means, since money doesn't spoil, you can acquire an unlimited amount of money, rightfully, according to Locke. And so under those circumstances, it becomes possible for people to acquire way more than they need. You can acquire way more land than you need to support yourself. And as long as you sell the produce of that land to other people in exchange for money, Locke would say you're not doing anything wrong. You didn't cause anything to spoil. And so because the invention of money makes it possible for people to acquire a lot of property, the invention of money, Locke thinks, really is one of the things that contributes to the fact that property holdings expand and eventually all the land and everything is owned, right? And so you don't just step out into a natural commons, you step out into a world where everything's already owned. And that's what money does. He talks about that in sections 47 through 50. And so, as I said, what Locke ends up really defending in chapter 5 is not so much this conception of the natural right to property, but really the benefits of private property and free exchange. And the argument that he makes is this, that allowing for private property and for people, by and large, to keep the fruits of their labor and to get rich and to freely exchange and contract with other people in society is better for everyone. Some might object. Once you have the invention of money, you have the division between rich and poor. You have a situation of inequality, a situation where the rich have way more than they need, and the poor don't have what they need, and that this is all really unjust. This is what sometimes the intuition behind arguments for a more egalitarian distribution of resources or for some form of socialism. And Locke makes the argument, no, actually, allowing for private property, not regulating how much people can have, but basically just allowing people to freely acquire and exchange property, make money, will make everybody better off. And the argument he gives is this. If you think about valuable things in your life, you realize that most of the things that are of value to human beings are not the direct products of nature, but rather are products of human labor, right? So nature gives you acorns, but human labor can give you bread. Nature gives you water, human labor can give you wine. Nature gives you a cave, human labor can give you a house, and so on and so forth. And if you look around yourself right now while you're listening to this lecture at all the things around you that are of value, you realize that almost none of it is a direct product of nature. Nature provides them raw materials, but the really useful things in our lives are all, sort of human manipulations of nature, modifications of nature. So homes, even the air, right? If you're sitting in air conditioning right now, even the air isn't really directly a product of nature. It's been conditioned. So Locke's basic insight here is this idea that most things that are really valuable to human beings are actually products of human labor. And so then his argument is, therefore, the most prosperous or best off society is going to be the society that most encourages people to use their labor to produce valuable things for others. And that's going to be a system that respects private property and free exchange. Um, because the basic idea is the possibility of getting rich incentivizes people to work harder, to work better, to innovate, to come up with new products. And when you have free economic exchange, and now obviously by free exchange I just mean one where the government is not telling people what they can charge, who they can sell to, but where basically prices for goods and services are determined on the market. That when you have a free market type system, really the way to get rich is to offer something that other people actually want, that they want so much that they're willing to pay money for it, right? So you don't get rich by forcing people to give you money. When there's that's the government can do that, and tyrants can do that, right? This is one of the things that Locke is arguing against, that the government can make rules saying only this person is allowed to sell this product in town, so give a person monopoly in that product, and the government can say you have to pay this amount for it, or you've got to give us this money, in taxation or something like that. The government can use coercion to distribute and to take economic resources, but private citizens on the market, the only way to make money is to offer something of value that people are willing to give money for. So Locke's argument is you want a system that encourages people to do that encourages people to work, that encourages people to produce things of value to others. And he says the kind of regime or the kind of system that's going to do that is going to be a free market system, because lots of people would like more money. They'd like to better their lot. They'd like to get rich. And if they know, hey, if I work harder, I'll get to earn more. Or if I sell this product, I'll get to keep the profits, instead of it being confiscated through taxes or corruption or bribery or something like that. That if people know that if they work harder or work better, they will be able to get ahead, so to speak, then a lot of people will do that. And that makes everybody better off, right? Yeah, this person makes more money, but the flip side of making more money is that other people have products that they value, right? So encouraging people to come up with things of value, Locke, is presenting it as a kind of a win-win situation, right? I produce, Steve Jobs, right, comes up with the iPhone. So he gets tons of money because lots of people buy it, but lots of people buy it because they want iPhones in their lives. It improves their quality of life or whatever. Now, a lot of these claims can be questioned, whether there really is such a thing as free exchange, whether our genuine needs are properly met in this kind of system. But Locke's basic argument is private property and the possibility of acquiring greater wealth through your efforts in the market gives people an incentive to be more productive. And when people are more productive, there is more wealth to go around. And so everybody is better off. More useful products, more opportunities for employment, and so on and so forth. These are sections 40 through 46 of chapter 5. So that's the other big part of his defense of property, and that's something that was also popular with a lot of the founders, this kind of idea of basically, let's get as much as possible, let's get the government out of economic life. The government, obviously, there will be certain health and safety regulations. There have to be all sorts of civil laws to prevent things like theft and fraud, and other uses of force, right? So you've got to respect the fact that, private property means that people have the right to determine how, what they do with their property. So you need to have a system of law to protect people in their property, of course. But beyond that, you more or less let things be determined through market forces, right? What gets made, how much of it, how much it costs, how much people get paid. Instead of the government determining those things, it's determined through open competition in the market. And that's why Locke is kind of, is one of the intellectual fathers of, the kind of free market economics. So that's Locke's understanding of private property. We have a natural right to private property because we have a right to preserve ourselves and we have a right to acquire through our labor what we need to survive. But then beyond that, he argues that a good society is going to respect private property and allow people to acquire through their own efforts because that will make everybody better off. So that's a really basic account of Locke's understanding of the right to property. And therefore, to say, the one thing that transfers here is to civil society is that if you say that the right to private property is a natural right, that means within your political community, the government has to arrange laws in such a way that people really do have an opportunity to work and to acquire, to be secure in the possession of their property. So the right to property must be respected by government through laws that protect people and also by maintaining a society where people are free to compete and free to engage in economic activity in the first place. So that's the basic account. Now that we've gone through the rights to life, liberty, and property, the state of nature, the law of nature, and all of that, in the next lecture, we will move on to Locke's account of the origin and purpose of government.